All right, week 11, time to talk through this GPP slate with my guy JMTOWIN, going through all of the angles, building a team on DraftKings with one of his favorite building blocks. You guys know the drill. It's the Block Party Show with Pete and JM.
Peter's one of the greatest depositors I've ever seen.
Trust the process. Let's go.
I got auto match with Levitan. Bullshit.
I just go the other way. In that 6v6, I win all the money. All the money.
If I had 150 lineups, I'd win too.
AP, 35 bullets to your head like KD. Bust it, bitch, go bust it. And I had 10 pints with me in Russia.
Hey, everyone.
All right, JM. Chuck asking the question. We all want to know, how are we feeling? We feeling better after your sick week?
I'm still like 85%. I don't know what this thing is. It's been lingering for 2 weeks, but it's, I guess, the same thing that all the NFL players are catching. It's like everywhere right now, this RSV thing, but it's a weird sickness. It doesn't really sap you that much of energy, just annoying upper respiratory stuff. So I'm good, ready to rock and roll this week.
Yeah, this is, I would say, maybe more so than I can remember, one of the more up in the air weeks. We have so many moving pieces. We legitimately don't know if this Buffalo Cleveland game is going to happen. We have lots of injury stuff. I know as far as looking at ownership projections and a lot of stuff right now, I'm just kind of shrugging my shoulders because it seems like so much is yet to be cemented for week 11.
Yeah, and I love weeks like that, right? Because people like to make their decisions early, not the sharpest competition that we're competing against for first place, but the average DFS player likes to have things out of the way. They like to kind of know what direction they're going. And so being nimble on a week like this is valuable. That Cleveland Buffalo game is definitely being played, right? It's being played in Detroit.
Well, that's what we thought. But as far as last I saw, Buffalo hasn't been able to get out of Buffalo yet. And their travel plans are still TBD. So yeah, it's a little sketchy.
Yeah. And that's interesting too, because people the salaries on those players will kind of prevent people from you kind of want to figure out what you're doing. And so it's harder to be and then I'll just pivot to Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs because that's a very different roster construction. So we should see lower ownership on those guys if that game ends up being played, just with all the uncertainty there. And I mean, it's a good week. It's a week where when I first started looking at things on Tuesday night, I was like, I don't even know how to build a roster on this week. And I spent an hour and a half trying to build a practice build and not actually putting anything together. And then Wednesday night, I came back and started going through things again with a different perspective. And instead of, we tend to look at players from a projection standpoint of okay, what's this guy's floor? What's his usage? What's his range of outcomes? But when you let go of that this week and you just look at ceiling, if you're just can this guy win me a tournament? Can this guy win me a tournament? It opens up a lot. And so this is a great week for tournament players because we can kind of let go of those floor concerns, let go of some certainty that we typically like to embrace, and target first place, target upside. And there's plenty of guys we could do that on. I think it'll be a really tough week for the field. And it started to kind of become a much easier week for me as I've gotten deeper into this one.
Yeah, and it looks like, even just looking at quarterback, where I know a lot of the conversations always start, I mean, at least early projections, everything, it is so spread out. I don't see anyone really separating. Obviously, Justin Fields is going to be popular, but, compared to previous weeks, we actually have some interesting names. Assuming Josh Allen's good to go, you got Hurts, you got Jackson, you got some interesting, cheap guys in Marcus Mariota and Daniel Jones. And then this isn't even to talk about Dak and Kirk Cousins, who might be playing in the best game of the week as well. So I can see people going all kinds of different directions at quarterback this week.
Yeah, we get chalky Kirk Cousins week, which is always a thrill. Yeah, that game is really interesting to me. We'll talk about it as we get deeper into the show. But over-under is 48.5, which for this season is a high over-under, but close spread. So implied team totals are 25 and 23.5. You can go bet the unders on those, right? That means that these lines, these implied team totals have not been moving. That means that Vegas, that sharp money, is still expecting 50% of the time the Cowboys score fewer than 25 points. 50% of the time, the Vikings scored fewer than 23.5 points. Cowboys invite teams to run on them. They face, I think it's the 6th lowest opponent pass play rate in the NFL, because who wants to face Micah Parsons? The Vikings are a pass-leaning team, but they'll probably be a little bit more run-leaning. The Cowboys want to try to get 30 backfield rush attempts for Zeke and Pollard every week to kind of play off the fact of how strong their defense is. So I could see this game going off, right? This game could be like a 30-33 game. It could be the game you had to have. This game could also underwhelm, and I think that it's more fragile chalk than people realize. I think that this is a game that on a different week people wouldn't be flocking to this one. So we talked about that last week with Damon Pierce, where we basically said on paper, he's a super sharp play. If you're playing cash games, put this guy in there, but also recognize that on a different week, this guy would be completely unpopular. And those are the types of chalk plays that we like to try to leverage and avoid and kind of find different paths to first place. So yeah, that's an interesting thing I'm looking at this week with this Dallas, Minnesota game. I think that there are a couple sites that are a bit high on this game. And so that will drive ownership. And that gives this a spot where we can kind of leverage things by doing things differently. You're playing this game a little bit differently. So I'll have interest in that game, but I also have interest in some other spots. And we also have guys like Joe Burrow, who's going to be under 4% owned again, because people are just like, oh, well, this offense can't hit anything through the air without Jamar Chase because we have a 2-game sample size of them not doing it, right? And it's like, well, one of those games they didn't even try because Joe Mixon was going nuclear. And then the other game, they didn't do well through the air. So that's a spot that I'm super interested in large field tournaments. I'm super interested in Josh Allen if he gets to play. And then we also have a week where you kind of go through all the players and you're like, can this guy get me 4X? Probably not. Can this guy get me 4X? Probably not. It's like the entire list of running backs are going to have a hard time hitting 4X their salary. But then if you go below David Montgomery, things get really thin in terms of, can these guys get me 3X, right? So you kind of have to pay 6K and above for a lot of these running backs, and yet you're not getting great production from these running backs. So it's an interesting week, and I think that there's a lot of fun edges that we can play around with this week.
For sure. And before we start to kind of dive in, I always like to circle back, do a little detour toward what we learned in week 10. Of course, Justin Fields once again finding his way into the winning Millie Maker lineup, and your guy who you called showing up in a winning Millie Maker lineup, George Pickens, although I don't think when you drew it up, it was with only 14.5 points. I think that's just how that lineup worked out, that he hit it up there. But your call
got that rushing touchdown. I saw that rushing touchdown coming.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on, because I loved the Pickett stuff that we built on the Friday show. I ended up rolling that out in the big spy. Obviously it doesn't get there, and yet they were still pretty close to paying off their salary just because they were so cheap.
Yeah, and I played mostly on Yahoo last week. I was in town all week, so I couldn't play on DraftKings, and played on Yahoo last week. And Pickett was the DraftKings equivalent of 5K in salary, but Fields and Tua were the DraftKings equivalent of 8.2K in salary. And Mahomes and Josh Allen were the equivalent of 10K in salary. So I went like super overweight on Pickens there because it was like, yes, he's a lesser play than these other guys, but in terms of where the salaries fall, still a lot of value. I was able to have a lot of those rosters kind of in play deep into Sunday, even though those guys didn't hit. One of the things we're seeing with that Steelers offense is that they kind of need the opponent to push them in order for them to really be aggressive, but they certainly have the upside if an opponent can put up some points against them. So another week where it's interesting, if the Bengals can put up points this week, then there's certainly an opportunity for somebody on the Steelers to hit. I'll be leaning toward Burrow in that game over Pickett just because they're priced close enough that's like, if Pickett's hitting, then Burrow's probably hitting for a bigger score. But I like that game environment this week. Is like a really sneaky one that people won't be on in tournaments.
Yeah. And we also, another guy that was in our building block from last week was Tony Pollard. That was even before Zeke got ruled out. You were on that one, but the field caught up to that one. And Tony Pollard definitely better usage, right? Didn't score as much as he did the week against the Bears. And yet we actually finally got a bell cow game, despite the coaches telling us that he would spontaneously combust after 30 snaps.
Yeah, it was a little bit wild to see them actually give Tony Pollard like enough snaps to matter. This week, Jerry Jones has said Zeke will be back. He said the defenses know how important that is for the Cowboys. Like he's like trying to convince the fans, trying to convince the locker room, like, hey, this guy's really good. You guys might not know it, but defenses certainly know it. So yeah, unfortunately, we don't get that week with Pollard this week. And I think that Zeke will actually be healthy. What I really wanted last week was Zeke active, and then expect that he would just be in a small role from like what we were hearing out of Dallas. But yeah, we got some good plays last week, and this is another week where it's like similar to last week, where we've had all these weeks where chalk was hitting, and then people are like, oh, well, I guess I should just play the chalk. And one of the things we've talked about is there's been a lot of sharp chalk, or there's been like 6, 7, 8 really sharp running back plays, and they're not all going to miss, right? So maybe like 2 of them miss, but the other 5 hit. And then people are like, oh man, I faded all of the popular running backs and some of them hit. Well, of course, some of them hit. They were great plays. And now we're in a second straight week where the chalk is a little bit more fragile. It's chalk that wouldn't be chalk on other weeks. And so that definitely gives us like some fun angles to play around with, similar to last week.
Yeah. And, one dynamic that continues to play out is the pricing is particularly tough at wide receiver, sub 5K. Yeah, sure. You can find some plays in the 4 to 5K range, but it is really, really thin sub 4K this week. And kind of a similar dynamic following from last week is that the tight ends, like price adjusted, look like better points per dollar play. So right now in early optimals, you're getting a ton of 2 tight end builds. I'm curious, like, how are you thinking about cheap wide receivers versus these cheap tight ends, where I think we see a similar dynamic where, yes, there are our Tyquan Thorntons or Van Jefferson, these guys who couldn't put up 20 points, and yet they're not going to project as well as these tight ends who are priced similarly, but you can project for more targets. I'm just curious how you're thinking about that dynamic. Are you willing to do double tight end builds? Like, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot of times we can forget how good we can be at predicting when a player is likely to hit versus when they're not likely to hit. So you can look at a Tyquan Thornton and be like, oh, he's only 3,300. He's on the field all the time. And people aren't going to be on him. Maybe he can hit, and maybe he can, but it's a really rough matchup for wide receivers. And it's a really low likelihood spot for him to hit. And we have a lot of these guys under 4,300, even the 4,300 wide receivers who we like, right? Like Paris Campbell is going to pop in projections this week and optimizer builds. He's going to be popular this week, but it's still like you're talking playing Paris Campbell at high ownership. That's not the most attractive thing to do. And it's going to be a place where I'm going on a decent chunk of my large field builds and maybe my main roster. But all that to say, like if Paris Campbell at chalk is the best cheap play, then that shows you how thin cheap wide receiver is. If Jerry Jeudy misses and Kendall Hinton plays, then he's very interesting. Although obviously he's going to ascend up ownership levels as well if he's the lead slot receiver there. So I noticed the same thing on Wednesday night when I started messing around with the optimizer, was that it was like 100 double tight end builds.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, I forgot to change my presets to say no tight ends in the flex, right? So I immediately went and did that and just kind of kept going through my process. And then last night I was building the bottom up build roster for the Angles podcast and for the player grid. And I was messing around with all these things, and it was like, okay, I wanted upside at quarterback. So I took Justin Fields, and then you have to get some upside at running back, because if you're just going sub 6K at running back, you're not getting a lot of upside there. But the bottom up build, it's a 44K salary cap. So you're not getting enough salary for upside at wide receiver. So it was like, all right, take Josh Jacobs at running back. And then it was like, man, I'm stuck in all these like 4,500 and below wide receivers. And after I put in Kendall Hinton and Paris Campbell, it's like, who's left? And I started realizing Pat Freiermuth, I went through the numbers on the Angles podcast today, but it's like so many games last year of like 12, 14, 15, 20 fantasy points. Dalton Schultz, the number 3 tight end last year in fantasy scoring, all these games of 21, 26, 17, 15. And you're like, man, if there were a wide receiver at 4,300 who were putting up these types of scores, we would flock to them. And so, yeah, on this particular week, and especially, like I said already with the macro state of the slate, Saquon Barkley is probably not hitting 4X. Maybe we go through the whole running back list, but Saquon Barkley, Nick Chubb, Dalvin Cook, Jonathan Taylor, Alvin Kamara, like all these guys are probably not hitting 4X their salary. The cheaper running backs are probably not hitting 4X. A lot of these wide receivers are not hitting 4X. So like these cheaper tight ends who can go for 4X, 5X, they actually become really valuable this week. I don't think that we take 2 tight ends and then there's some cheap wide receiver who blows up for 25 points and we're like, oh, why didn't we consider that guy, right? I think that's a pretty low probability likelihood. And I think that even though optimizers are pushing this 2 tight end build, I think people have had it hammered into them so much like 2 tight end is not optimal, that they're not going to be able to adjust to the fact that it is kind of optimal this week. And so one of the things that I talk about all the time is anytime we can break a rule in a way that it actually makes sense, like in the smaller sample size of that game or that week or that offense, it helps us, because a lot of people don't feel comfortable breaking rules. So we have macro studies that show that 2 tight ends is typically not optimal, but on the small sample size of this week, it actually makes a lot of sense. And so, Zandemir's on vacation this week. He's the one who always makes fun of 2 tight end builds. So thankfully I can get away with not being chastised and doing some 2 tight end builds this week.
Yeah, and I know even the cash game grinders, Levitan, felt sick to his stomach running out a 2 tight end build in cash, because it just seems to break all of those rules. But I mean, when you look at the numbers and just the projections, they just project for better points per dollar plays. And sure, maybe they don't have the Tyquan Thornton splash play ability, but any of these guys can score 2 touchdowns. Like Dawson Knox can wake up with 2 touchdowns. It's not like they don't have a ceiling, and they have, a similar floor to those other guys anyway. So yeah, I think that's interesting. And I think the thing I wrestle with is that idea of making sure you are getting a ceiling when you're using these. Like, it's when you're putting in 2 punt play guys, and
exactly.
The best case scenario is they only get 10 points. It's like, I really want to be able to tell myself they can at least, get a touchdown and get to 15 or 16.
Yeah. Like, I'll go through Hayden Hurst's game logs for this year. 8.5 points, 8.2 points, 10.8 points, 5.1 points, 17.3 with a touchdown, 11.7 with a touchdown, 1.7 points, 7.4 points. And so we think of this guy as like, oh, he's consistent, but he's consistent at a thin position where it's sometimes hard to get points, right? But if we go through Freiermuth's game logs, if we go through Dalton Schultz game logs with Dak Prescott, they're not consistent for a tight end. They're consistent for a guy priced where they're priced. Greg Dulcich, we don't have a large enough sample size to say anything, but if Judy's out, he has a lot of upside. And those are really the 3 guys that I'm likely to gravitate toward, because a lot of these other guys, like, that's the problem with the tight end position, why we don't play 2 tight ends in the flex is if they have a big game, they're getting you 14, 15 points, and they might get you 3 points, 5 points, 7 points. But this is an interesting week in which we have a couple tight ends who, and if, like, let's say David Njoku is healthy this week, we could throw Tyler Higbee into that bucket in a really tough matchup for tight ends, but with no Cooper Kupp. These guys who have like legitimate roles and are probably getting you 9 to 12 points even without a touchdown, have a clear shot at 18, 20 points. And it's a very different story than like the typical 2 tight end build where we're just punting tight ends to save some salary. These are guys who can actually get you scores. And you say the thing about these guys don't have the splash play upside, but these guys at the splash play upside, they have low enough volume that a lot of times if they're hitting those splash plays, they're getting you 20 points, right? Occasionally 21, 22 points. And realistically, Schultz, Freiermuth, maybe some of these other guys, they have higher floors and can still get you to 20 plus points. So I very much like these plays. And realistically, I mean, this was just last night that I started getting onto this, but realistically, I could end up like really heavy with Schultz and Freiermuth and just saying, let me do like spin out 30, 40% with just locking these 2 in together and saying, like, the floor and ceiling on these guys is great for their price tags and allows me to do a lot else elsewhere.
And that was going to be my next thing. So you say Schultz and Freiermuth, how much of that set would you have them stacked with Dak or Pickett, or even stacked with the opposing quarterback? Because that's one other thing I've been thinking about with these punt tight ends is that they are thin. And if they are reaching their 90th percentile outcome, it's probably going to be because of some correlation. It's the same thing I was thinking back a couple weeks of, like, no one wanted to do Cole Kmet. He had a very low involvement in the offense. And then we finally see the explosion and he comes along for the ride. And it's like, that's my only other thing with them. Is like, if I am punting it off with 2 of these, I really want some correlation there.
I disagree on that. And so for me, it's about focal points of an offense. Like, Freiermuth is one of 3 guys that their scheming looks to, right? And Freiermuth is, 7 to 9 targets basically every game. And that doesn't mean that Kenny Pickett's hitting a ceiling outcome and being the quarterback that you had to have this week. Dak is 6,600 and Schultz is only 4,300. I mean, there were a lot of games last year where you would have taken, especially on a slate like this, where we're not going to have a lot of cheap guys who put up points, where you would have taken the 14 to 17 to 20 points from Schultz. And it didn't mean that Dak was putting up 26, 27 points himself. And so I'll certainly have some Dak and Schultz, but I'll probably have, I think a lot of people will pair their Schultz with Dak. And I think that Schultz can hit independent of Dak being the quarterback that you had to have. So I'm not against it. I'm not against it on the Dak side. I'm probably not playing Pickett this week myself, even though I think that the upside is there for him. But the on the Schultz one, I'm totally fine playing Dak. I'm totally fine making that pairing. But I don't see it as a place where I have to force it in, because it's not a spot like Kmet where you're saying, okay, if Kmet has a big game, it's probably coming through a multi-touchdown game. That multi-touchdown game, he had only 6 targets. And so he needed to like hit those 2 touchdowns, or I guess, was it back-to-back? Did he have 2 touchdowns last week or just the one? He had 2 touchdowns last week on 4 catches, right? And so it's like the lower volume, he's got to get those touchdowns. But Freiermuth and Schultz, like, they can catch 7 passes for 70 yards even before a touchdown, right? And that doesn't mean that their quarterback's hitting. So since they're more focal points of their offense, they're guys that I don't necessarily need to pair.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think it's more going the other direction rather than like we like these tight ends and then you're not forcing a quarterback with it. But if you're stacking Josh Allen and you're stacking Justin Fields, Marcus Mariota, maybe some of these guys that I do find myself wanting to toss in the Dawson Knox.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But
yeah, like you can say if you're playing this quarterback, like it's one of the easiest ways to cover that tight end position is to say, well, you get your tight end for free if this guy hits, right? Like your tight end is much likelier to hit if this quarterback is hitting. And so I think that, like for me, the tight end position this week will probably be a lot of this like double tight end with these higher percentage guys. I might throw Dulcich in there on a decent chunk. And then outside of those rosters, it'll be primarily guys paired with their quarterbacks. So that'll mean some Hayden Hurst as well. Like with Burrow, that'll mean some Kmet with Fields. That'll mean some Dawson Knox with Josh Allen. But in terms of like what I feel is the optimal approach, just in a vacuum, it would be a couple of these guys with like bankable roles and real ceiling.
Let's talk a little bit about kind of like the macro of the slate. And I know you cover this in some of your angle stuff. You have your piece in the Fantasy Life newsletter today looking at some bigger picture stuff. I mean, as far as game environments, we have the two nice ones here close to a 50-point total, Chicago, Atlanta, which we've been talking about. And then, of course, Cleveland, Buffalo. And then we have the Minnesota Dallas game at 47.5. And then you have a couple teams with big implied team totals, Baltimore with a 27 and Eagles with a 26. Like, what's kind of your macro take on this slate as far as how many game environments you're ultimately interested in?
It's really interesting because there's only 5 teams implied to score more than 24 points, which is kind of ridiculous. And we can poke serious holes in all 5 of these teams. And I'll do it real quickly. The Bills are my favorite of the bunch, but you got to really pay up to get the only guaranteed points, which is Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs. And then everybody else, they kind of spread the ball around. They spread some upside around. And so everybody else has like a roster cratering floor to go with their ceiling. The Eagles are not a team that typically justifies their salaries in just the way that they play and the way that they kind of approach offense, right? They've topped 30 points twice all season. They're in a really tough matchup on the ground and for like explosive pass plays. People don't really realize the Colts have allowed, I think it's the second fewest wide receiver yards and the third fewest wide receiver catches per game. Like the Colts defense, the way it's structured to take away wide receivers, people don't think of it like, oh, this is a scary matchup like the Eagles or the Broncos. And yet it has been that way for wide receivers. So really tough on these high price tags, these Eagles pieces to actually hit. The Ravens, in Gus Edwards' last 7 healthy games with Lamar Jackson has topped 23 pass attempts only once in those 7 games. He's failed to top even 18 pass attempts in 4 of those 7 games. Lamar Jackson, since the start of last year, has topped 23.1 DraftKings points 5 times. Now, all 5 of those times has been 35 plus points. 3 of those has been 40 plus points. And that's why we always say like, oh, Lamar Jackson can always hit for like a monster game. But all 5 of those games where he hit for 35 plus points were all shootouts. 56 combined points in one, 60 plus combined points in the other 4, including a game of 70 plus combined points, a game of 80 combined points. So do we really think that the Panthers are pushing the Ravens out of their run heavy game plan, pushing Lamar Jackson to attack? Probably not. And then we've got the Cowboys are obviously in a spot where they'd like to run the ball. Maybe CeeDee Lamb hits big. Maybe this game goes off. I actually like this game, right? But I'm just saying you can poke holes in all of these. And then the last one is Atlanta, 26 implied points. But their Marcus Mariota's over-under for passing yards is like 164.5. So that means that median projection, like 50% of the time he's going to finish below that number. It's hard for one of his pass catchers to hit. And then their backfield is split 4 ways, not even including Mariota taking some of the rushing upside. So and then you poke holes in all 5 of those. And then you get to the other 17 games and they're all implied to score 24 or fewer points. So it's just one of these weeks where, people are going to say, oh, well, these are the best game environments because of this, but it's like they're different best game environments than most weeks, which is why somebody like Burrow, the kind of guy who, we look back on Sunday night, we're like, why didn't we see this? Why didn't we realize that this guy could hit for a huge game? Those are the types of plays that I'm super interested in this week. Burrow's not going to project well because of the 22.5 point team total, right. But it wouldn't surprise us if on Sunday night we're like, oh man, Burrow put up 30 plus points and he was the guy that we had to have. And so I probably won't have him on my main build, but he's going to be mixed heavily into my large field play. And then guys like Josh Allen who can actually break the slate. But yeah, so it's interesting because like the high total spots have serious holes that you can poke in them. But then below the high total spots, it's ugly as well. So it's a really interesting slate in that people will gravitate toward the high total spots or toward the perceived certainty, but there's not much that you can really go to outside of those spots either. So we can find some angles to play around with, but also we kind of have to take some bad chalk along the way.
Yeah. And you mentioned kind of bad chalk. I thought I always like doing this as an exercise just to see kind of what's showing up as this is the current ceiling optimal right now. Obviously this is going to be pending a decent amount of news here, but again, strikes me as some interesting names. You mentioned Paris Campbell earlier, Damian Pierce. What are your thoughts on him here being chalk at 6,500? Because he's one to me that I'm always willing to fade at high ownership.
Yeah, I mean, taking on the number 2 run defense by DVOA, and he needs a 2 touchdown game on a team that might not score 2 touchdowns as a whole. So he's not. I mean, I'm always hesitant to say something like this because I'm never saying this guy is incapable of hitting. Damian Pierce has it in his range of outcomes. He gets enough touches that he could come out and put up 30 points. I will have 0% Damian Pierce this week, and if he's the reason I lose this week, I'll be totally fine with that. But no, he's not even on my radar. He's one of those guys who, since I build in a bubble, right? I come out of the bubble and it's like, oh, really? You guys all want to play this guy? I'm fine with that, right? So yeah, he's not even on my radar this week. I know that a lot of the optimizer builds that I've put out there, like just to kind of get a sense of things, have pushed David Montgomery onto my roster. So I think that we'll see a lot of David Montgomery as well. I like the mixing call. I also obviously like Burrow as some leverage off of Mixon. I'll have a lot of pieces of the Cincinnati offense. Like somebody on that offense is probably putting up a big game, and so I'll mix and match them across all of my tournament builds.
What is your thought? I mean, we hit on Paris Campbell a little bit. He does, project as the best, cheaper wide receiver. You mentioned Kendall Hinton might open up. But even earlier in the week, too, I know Michael Pittman and Jonathan Taylor also didn't look bad. And yet the Eagles are so expensive that it's hard to get them. It's hard to build around them. I'm curious, how do you think about that? Because I was like, man, if you want to play the Eagles, do you sidestep, some of these chalky, maybe bad plays coming back? Or if you're hitting your upper outcome for the Eagles, do you necessarily have to have someone from the Colts? I'm just curious how you would think about it. Or are you just kind of avoiding the Eagles altogether this week?
Yeah, I'm not going to be on that game environment. I'll be on some Colts. I'll be on some Jonathan Taylor. I'll be on some Paris Campbell. If I were playing that game environment, though, if I were saying Eagles smash, right? If I'm saying the Eagles score 30 plus points, they do enough to pay off the price tags on Jalen Hurts, on AJ Brown, on Devontae Smith, whoever it is. I would have to imagine that one of these pass catchers on the Colts is doing something, right? Because the Colts have shown a willingness to go pass heavy. And so even though it's a really tough matchup through the air for the Colts wide receivers, it would seem like Paris Campbell. I used to have the Paris Hilton pairing with Paris Campbell and T.Y. Hilton.
Yeah.
Paris
Campbell. The benefit of the doubt of where your mind's at, Jan.
There you go. Paris Campbell and Michael Pittman are cheap enough that one of them would probably be putting up an adequate score, I'd have to think. Alec Pierce is also in there. He's going to come in really low owned because he hasn't been the apple of Matt Ryan's eye recently, but he has some good games. Although Paris Campbell, right, given how thin value is, given the fact that he has 9 to 12 targets in his last 3 games with Matt Ryan, and given the fact that I think people probably don't recognize how big of a deal that Avonte Maddox is now on IR. So one of the things that's made the Eagles so strong in the secondary, think about the Darrelle Revis years, right? Where the Jets could say, put Darrelle Revis on one guy, and now we're playing 10 on 10 the rest of the way, right? Well, one of the things that the Eagles have been able to do is James Bradbury on one side, Darius Slay on the other side, and then Avonte Maddox in the slot, and that kind of neutralizes the wide receivers, and then they can play 8 on 8 from there. And Avonte Maddox, Nick Sirianni's talked about this year, because slot wide receivers can go downfield, they can break outside, they can break inside, the typical slot corner needs help in one of those 3 areas. And he said that Avonte Maddox is one of the rare guys who needs help in none of those 3 areas. So they can just say, you cover the slot. So that definitely changes the setup here in that, yes, it's been a terrible matchup for wide receivers, but with Avonte Maddox out, it makes it a little bit easier on Paris Campbell, right? Who's the guy who Matt Ryan has been looking to most frequently. So I don't think that he's bad chalk. It's fragile chalk. But on what this week gives us, it's certainly viable to play Paris Campbell, and he's certainly a guy I will be playing. Although, this is a guy who was being drafted in the Battle Royale as if he has a real ceiling, right? I mean, this is just a crazy week. It's what this week gives us, that you get 6 rounds of battle royale drafts, 3 wide receivers max per roster, and Paris Campbell's one of those 18 wide receivers being drafted in almost every battle royale draft. So yeah, it's just a really, really interesting week. So in that particular game, if I were on the Eagles, I'd feel comfortable bringing it back with one of these pass catchers saying, probably if the Eagles are putting up the type of score they would need at these price tags, somebody over here is doing something in response.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I'm curious your thoughts too. We have a few spots and we're going to talk a little bit more about Fields and Montgomery, but I'm curious about like those pairings. I think another one you could bring up would be Daniel Jones and Barkley. Both of these situations where you have, maybe underpriced quarterbacks who rush a bit, and yet their running backs are in super good spots as well. I know on the Swolecast on Wednesday, I started us off with a Daniel Jones Barkley build, and people were repulsed by this thought here. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts about those scenarios too, of thinking about a quarterback running back as far as a block for those pairings?
Yeah, we've done that a couple times, right? We started out the season with Trey Lance and Elijah Mitchell.
Yeah.
We had something a couple of weeks ago. I would be more prone to do it on David Montgomery and Justin Fields, I'd have to say. Because if we take like combined score of Justin Fields, Khalil Herbert, David Montgomery the last couple of weeks, those would be pretty nice scores at that combined price tag. And I don't think that David Montgomery will just see all the touches, but I also don't feel confident that the Bears feel confident in Tristan Ebner quite yet. So I think that Montgomery should see like a pretty sizable workload. He's proven in the past, not to this coaching staff, but he's proven in the past that he can handle like a full-on workhorse role. Saquon plus Daniel Jones, it's interesting because Saquon, I mean, that costs 14.6K in combined salary. You want like 60 points. Like Saquon has topped 26 points only once this season. He's topped like 22.7 points only twice this season. And he basically, like there were 4 games this year where if he'd had 2 touchdowns, he would have topped 30. And one of those games he would have scored 42, but the others he would have scored like 30 to 36, 32 to 36 points. And so then you have to think like, well, if he's scoring 2 touchdowns, how does Daniel Jones also get 30 points of his own when there's not that many touchdowns to go around on this offense? So that one would be a little bit harder for me to pull the trigger on just because it's, and I will say like, again, this is an interesting week. Like I've talked about potentially playing Antonio Gibson and Brian Robinson together. And you look at it, it's like 10.9K in combined salary. Can they get over like 35 to 40 points? Probably not, right? Like their max is a little bit below 4X their combined salary. And then you're like, yeah, but a lot of people won't hit 4X this week. And so if you just get close to that on a couple guys and then find a few guys who do hit that, you're probably winning a tournament. So I could see like 50 combined points from Saquon Daniel Jones actually being powerful enough to win. But I don't know that I would want to take up that large of a chunk of salary and that premium quarterback position in chasing that this week. So I don't want to poo-poo on your Swolecast Daniel Jones Saquon pairing, but yeah, no, I think it's very interesting, and I think that the fact that people don't break that rule often enough definitely gives us an edge when we want to do that. But I would gravitate toward Montgomery and Fields on that one.
Yeah, we'll talk about those guys more. There's 2 other spots I kind of want to get your thoughts on before we dig into our building blocks. One is because I know you're listening to these coaches talk, these press conferences. What is your read on this DeAndre Swift situation where he continues to not be on the injury report, but clearly his usage is limited? I think we saw some positive quotes today about scaling him up, but I feel like we've heard that every single week. So how are you thinking about kind of DeAndre Swift and obviously as it pertains to Jamal Williams as well?
I played DeAndre Swift on like 8% of my builds last week, but he was like cheaper on Yahoo as well. Just thinking, man, if this guy comes out and gets the role that he can have, he can be an actual tournament difference maker, which is hard to find. He's still priced at like 6,500 on DraftKings. Is that right?
6,100. Yeah.
If we look through his game logs, in fact, let me pull that up real quick. He doesn't actually have the scoring potential with Jamal Williams healthy that people think he has, right? Last year, he had 1 game above 25.6 points. 1 game. This year, he had that 29.5 pointer. The year before that, he had 1 game above 25.9 points. So it's not like this is a guy who goes out there and puts the slate out of reach. We think about him as like this super explosive guy, and he is, but it's because he does it on such a limited number of touches, right? It's not like he comes out and puts up these scores where we're like, God, I couldn't have won without him. It's not like he puts up Aaron Jones type scores, right? He puts up basically 3.5 to 4x salary when he hits his high end of his range, with like one time per season when he's gone above that. So he's not a guy I'm scared to miss out on. He's not a guy that I think will necessarily win me a tournament. And so at this price tag, he's not a guy I necessarily want to take the risk on. But with that said, I'm all for embracing risk, and I'm all for embracing risk on a week like this where there's a lot of uncertainty, right? If this were a week where you had Kenneth Walker and Travis Etienne and Ramondre Stevenson with no Damian Harris and Joe Mixon, all priced at 6.5K or below, then it'd be like, there's literally no reason to even think about this play, because just go to the good plays, right? Some of these good plays are going to hit. But on a week like this, where a lot of the popular plays could miss, I would not argue against anybody saying, let me put DeAndre Swift on here and hope he gets 25 points, because that actually could be a tournament winner. But I don't think that's a place where I will be going this week. Last note on that, you remember, I don't know if you watched Hard Knocks this year, but when Deuce McAllister was like hammering into him, is it Deuce McAllister or is it Deuce Staley? Whoever it is, was hammering into him like, yeah, it's Deuce Staley. He's like, you got to run these guys over. You got to be powerful. And it's like, do you realize that not every running back has to do that? Do you realize that maybe DeAndre Swift is like one of the best in-space backs in the NFL, and you should be protecting his body instead of trying to punish the opponent? I just thought that was ridiculous when I watched it. And then now he's been hurt all season. Like, well, yeah, like, tell this guy, get out of bounds. Don't pick up 2 extra yards into the second quarter to try to like send a message to the quarterback. Get out of bounds, protect your body, keep yourself healthy for the season.
Yeah, it is. It's frustrating. And I do think that is a really good takeaway of, we have this association of DeAndre Swift as this explosive guy, but it's like he would have to be all world efficient on his touches to be able to get there, because he's just not getting enough touches to do it. One other situation I want to get your thoughts on, because I do think he'll be the guy that gets squeezed up there, is Lamar Jackson. We have a little uncertainty around Mark Andrews. It sounds like he's trending toward playing. I know earlier in the week, the underdog line I hopped on, he was at 182 passing yards for Lamar Jackson. They did bump it up to 191.5 just a bit ago, I assume, with Mark Andrews looking like he's going to play. But what is your thoughts about Mark Andrews, how he fits in with these other elite guys? And I mean, he looks close projection-wise to Fields, but everyone's going to rather play Fields for 800 cheaper.
Yeah, so I won't have Lamar at all, just because, okay. I think that he's still going to grab 6, 7, 8% ownership. And as I talked about, like, we have this perception of like, man, this guy can hit when we're not expecting it. You got to always have some Lamar, but we have a pretty long track record of he's probably not hitting unless the game environment takes off. And we have a pretty long track record of when Gus Edwards is healthy, there's a particular way that they like to run this offense. Mark Andrews is more interesting to me. I don't actually expect Mark Andrews to have a huge game, but if he comes in with low projected ownership because of the shoulder injury, because of the uncertainty surrounding his role and all that, then he's a guy that I'll be overweight the field on Mark Andrews, just because he can do it on 7, 8, 9 targets. But it would be harder for me to go to that high price tag on Lamar Jackson, especially because I expect him to come in with higher projected ownership than Josh Allen, who I think is just a much better in a vacuum play anyway. And so I would rather go to Josh Allen or pay a little bit down for Justin Fields. And that's not to say, again, it's not to say that Lamar Jackson can't hit, but it's to say that the field like overrates his chances of hitting in a random matchup where they should actually absolutely dominate in this game against the Panthers.
And what are your, real quick, while we're on that, what's your thoughts on Isaiah Likely? Say Mark Andrews doesn't play. I know what happened, I think it was a few weeks ago, one of those Waller weeks too, where the whole thought is like, yeah, Waller gets scratched at the last minute. Of course, Foster Moreau is going to be super popular, but it was one of those situations where it's not locked into people's optimizers, their builds early in the week. There's always a bit of a lag there. Do you think Likely could be, relatively sneaky, even if Andrews is scratched at the last minute?
Yeah, I think so. There's a lengthy tight end list this week that's pretty viable, right? Tyler Conklin is pretty viable. Hayden Hurst is pretty viable. Foster Moreau is pretty viable. Greg Dulcich is pretty viable. Tyler Higbee, Cole Kmet, Pat Freiermuth, Dalton Schultz, Kyle Pitts. And so it's not like people are just going to say, oh, Isaiah Likely is the guy that we have to go to at this point. And so I think that people will feel pretty comfortable with whatever tight ends they've settled on and maybe not pivot over to him. And he should come in with lower ownership because of that. We know that, like, we've seen what he's capable of, and a lot of that was in preseason, but we've seen that this guy is capable of putting up like a monster stat line on an offense that favors the tight end. So I think that he becomes very interesting if Mark Andrews is out.
Yeah, going to keep an eye on that one. And as we head here to build a lineup on DraftKings with some of JM's building blocks, these are pieces that JM adds to the scroll every week, which is part of the 1 week season sub. It is their main hub to get you prepared for the week's action. And is the pricing still at 60% off right now?
So
JM?
still at 60% off. Pete 60 gets you 60% off rest of season Inner Circle, rest of season OWS DFS.
Yep. And, I highlight it here every week. You have all you need to get prepared for the slate. Obviously, this stuff gets populated throughout late in the week as we get more information. And, we always build with one of JM's building blocks that he's happy to share with us here. And then the rest of them he writes about at length in the scroll. Any other pieces that you are particularly excited about in the scroll this weekend, JM?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always excited about the scroll is like my central hub for balancing my thoughts of everybody else's, but always excited about the end around, always excited about Mike's player pool, always excited about willing to lose. And then Sonic's MME pool, like this is one of the top MME players, and he has notes on like 90% of the players in the field that he's considering that week. So another one that I always love reading to balance my thoughts off of what Sonic is thinking.
There you go. So you guys can get a rest of season pass with either the OWS DFS package or the Inner Circle. You can get 60% off of that. I know a bunch of you guys hopped on that deal last week. You can hop on it now. That's Pete 60. And then if you do just want to test drive, poke around, do that 1 week pass, the 20% off will still work with promo code Pete. I have links down below. And as always, too, if you guys sign up for a season pass, shoot me a DM and I'd be happy to add you to the private DFS Discord in the Deposit Kingdom as well. But now it is the time everyone has been waiting for, the building blocks portion of the show. All right, we have, again, the Deposit Kingdom Weekly League, 420 entries. Looks like we are at 269 out of 420. Very nice, very chill, very dank. That link is in the Deposit Kingdom Discord in the announcement section. Let's get this filled up so my DK rep indulges me in my meme entry size every single week. JM, we are going to build a lineup here. Some people will love it. Some people will hate it. Some people will hate it. And that is the beauty of it every week. So what are we thinking here for our main block?
Okay, so one of the games that, and I'll say, like, we had some approaches that were a little less chalky than this, but if we're playing chalk, we want to figure out how to play it intelligently and strategically. And one of the games that everybody's going to be focused on is Chicago at Atlanta. The either or question of Justin Fields versus David Montgomery is an interesting one. We also know that Mariota is going to be one of the popular, cheaper quarterbacks. So one of the ways we can play this is Mariota plus David Montgomery. This basically tells a story in which Mariota ends up hitting the 24, 25 points that he's capable of hitting, and where the scoring across quarterbacks as a whole is such that this 4.5, 5x score from Mariota actually becomes really powerful. In a typical week, I wouldn't want the guy who I'm like, yeah, but they can't score 30. They can't put up a huge raw score. But on this particular week, I don't think Lamar Jackson's getting to 30 points. I don't think Jalen Hurts is getting to 30 points. And you got to pay all the way up to Josh Allen if you want to get one of these guys who's probably putting up 30 points. And then the other guy we have to worry about is Justin Fields. Well, by putting David Montgomery on this roster, we basically say this is a game in which Justin Fields sure plays well. The Bears put up points, but the touchdowns don't flow through Fields. So instead of Fields putting up 40, he puts up, we know that he's not going to pass for more than 200 yards in most scenarios. So even if we give him 8 points through the air, even if we give him 60 rushing yards, that's 14 points right there. And if he only gets 1 or 2 passing touchdowns or 1 rushing touchdown, 1 passing touchdown, he's sitting at like 18, 20, 24 points. So if that happens, Mariota becomes much more powerful at a lower price tag. David Montgomery's taking points away from Justin Fields, which helps us complete the story here. And then this will still be a chalky build. So how do we set this apart a little bit more? We throw in a pass catcher with Marcus Mariota. And as we know, the best way to do that when it's kind of unpredictable where to go is to say, well, let's cover this tougher tight end position. So Kyle Pitts, we mentioned all these tight ends who were kind of attractive this week, and we should expect Kyle Pitts to be like the least attractive of all of these tight ends to most people. So he'll come in with low ownership in spite of the fact that Marcus Mariota will be high owned, and he basically offsets the Mariota Montgomery ownership here. And if Mariota gets 25 points, we got a good shot at Kyle Pitts getting 14, 15, even as much as 20 points. We've seen him put up 30 points one time in the past. And so he certainly has that type of ceiling. And so this gives us kind of some lower ownership combinatorially on a game that should be pretty popular.
Yeah, and I was thinking through this one too, because this game was interesting to me, particularly the Atlanta side, because it is going to be the side that's less preferable. I think, people are fully on board with the Justin Fields experience. I bet you'll see a lot of Fields Montgomery and then a Mooney tossed in, a Fields Montgomery Claypool, Fields Montgomery Kmet. And so thinking, what are the ways we can attack this? So I love this starting point here. I guess the one thing I would say, and this is what I was struggling with, is if this game goes completely bonkers, like we get one of these, Justin Fields games again. Well, actually, that's not the way I want to say it, but we get a, 60 combined points. In those scenarios, I feel like you're going to really want to have Justin Fields. So this is more playing for a moderate outcome in this game and where the other elite quarterbacks don't separate. Does that check out for you?
Yeah, except let's also put it like this. Justin Fields, back-to-back weeks, he's had the 100-yard bonus. I think a few years ago, it might have been Josh Allen's rookie year, that he became the first quarterback in history to rush for 100 yards in 3 consecutive games. And then it would have been 4 consecutive games, except he had 99 yards in one of those. So I say that to say, it's not like when Fields puts up 178, 147, it's like when Jacobs put up 140 plus rushing yards in 3 straight games. And it's like, oh, well, this guy's just going to keep doing this. And then all of a sudden it's 70 yards, 60 yards, 80 yards. This 2-game sample size, the recency bias, it lights up things in our brain to where we're like, oh God, Fields is going to keep doing this. But they could have a monster scoring output where Fields gets 10 fewer points on the ground than he's been getting, because you take away the 3 points for the 100-yard bonus, and then you take away 90 yards from a couple weeks ago.
Touchdown run.
You take away 50, 60 yards from last week. And now all of a sudden these are 30-point scores instead of 40-point scores. And then last week he scored 2 rushing touchdowns. The week before he scored 1 rushing touchdown. So realistically, Fields could have a monster game. He could rush for 80 yards. He could keep getting the Bears down there close to the end zone. And all it takes is him not being the guy who runs in the touchdowns, right? And so how many rushing touchdowns does he have this year? He has 6 rushing touchdowns, and 5 of them have come in his last 4 games. So it's not unreasonable to think that he's going to go a game sometime soon without a rushing touchdown. And so if he ends up under 100 yards, no rushing touchdown, he becomes this 23, 24, 25-point guy. And this could still be a game that goes off, and it could still be because Fields is dominating on the ground and is opening things up, but David Montgomery scores 2 touchdowns or 3 touchdowns. So I actually think that we could get one of these 60-point games, and we've actually seen the Falcons have these random games where they, the scoring is elevated, right? They had what was 71 combined points in their game with Carolina. They had a 50-pointer with Seattle. They had a 58-pointer with the Rams. They had a 53-pointer with New Orleans. And so, yeah, we could have a game where there's 50 plus combined points, maybe as many as 60 combined points. Fields is doing a great job, but he's just not getting the rushing touchdown, not getting the 100-yard bonus. And that totally changes the score that he ends up getting, and could hopefully tilt those points over to Montgomery. So, yeah, I actually think we could end up with a 55 to 60-point game and still have Fields not be the guy you had to have from this one and Montgomery be the guy instead.
This was going to be my next question as Ryan brings up too here. Is it way too insane to double Mariota? One of the things, if you do force a double stack and a bring back on an optimizer right now with just ceiling projections, you will get Mariota double stacks just because Drake London is so cheap as well. And I'm curious kind of your thoughts on it. It's a little similar to me as far as pricing wise last week when you were double stacking Pickett, where you're able to get so many projected targets, I guess I should say, at such a low price point. Is that something you would entertain, or do you prefer a single stack with Mariota?
I would prefer a single stack myself. Mariota's high in passing yards is 253 yards. And one of the things I always like to lean on is my coaching knowledge. And I know that there's nothing that's going to push Arthur Smith away from his run leaning game plan. We've seen the Falcons down 3 scores in the second half and still going run heavy. So it would take something cosmic for them to be hey, we're going to pass the ball a bunch. And so you're kind of threading a pretty thin needle in terms of low volume and needing these guys to hit. And since it's PPR scoring, volume is so valuable for us that we're already kind of having to bet on Kyle Pitts outlier game, getting the touchdowns, getting some big plays. It's going to be harder for Drake London to do it. Now, that said, in large field play, anything's viable, right? If I'm playing the Millie Maker or even the slant, I've got to beat 50,000 rosters are going to beat 200,000 rosters. I'm willing to put that on like 2-3 out of 150 builds, but that's not something that I would like have central in my thinking, something that I would really want to focus on.
Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. And so now we're doing pretty well salary wise. We definitely can spend up for some studs. What direction would you be leaning to go next year?
So one of the things that I would want to see is like, I wouldn't mind getting some pieces in here and then having 4 or 5K in salary left over in order to see, okay, where do we have some flexibility? Because one of the things that we do know this week is that value is really thin. So part of the genesis of the bottom up build was the fact that people tend to start at the top and then they're like, man, I've got 3,300 in salary left over. Oh yeah, I can see this guy having a big game, right? Whereas if we start at the bottom, then we can really see what's actually available. So if we want to start kind of lower end, I don't mind putting Paris Campbell onto this roster as a placeholder just to get a sense of what's available. I don't mind throwing a tight end into the flex on this roster as a placeholder to get a sense of what's available, and then throwing in a cheap defense to get a sense of what's available. A cheap defense I like this week is the Jets, top 6 defense by DVOA against a Patriots team that's like second or third in the NFL in turnovers. Since we're not playing Cowboys pieces yet, Cowboys Vikings pieces, another way we could go is the Vikings leverage the fact that the Vikings have forced the second most turnovers in the NFL and that we would be pulling away from a game environment everybody else would be betting on. But the Jets are definitely a sharper on paper play and only 400 more. So Jets, and if we wanted to say, hey, we're not playing the Vikings, so let's put in Dalton Schultz, we could do that in the flex. And then if we want to, swap over to like a CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson type thing, then we can always move off of Schultz to a different tight end. And then if we throw in Paris Campbell, we'll kind of get a sense of what our salary looks like from there.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely like the idea of like the cheaper defense and the double tight end. I think it's a little tougher for me to stomach a one-off chalky Paris Campbell. Like if we weren't using maybe an Eagles piece and hoping for a little bit more in that game. But I also get it. Like I understand why he's going to be chalk. It's just one-off piece there. I'd never always registers well with me.
Yeah, and I mean we're totally fine moving off of Paris Campbell as well. But even if we look at this, like all the running backs, unless we go to like the Brian Robinson, Antonio Gibson range, we're going to have to take like a running back who's 7K. And then that's going to leave us with like 7,500 wide receiver. And if we have that, we don't want to take 2 wide receivers in that price range, right? We'd love to get up to like the Justin Jefferson or the Stephon Diggs, which then forces us down to like one of these 6K or 5K wideouts. So even with Paris Campbell, we don't have that much salary flexibility left. And so this just kind of gives us a sense of how tight this week really is. And maybe we go to like we don't want Diggs without Josh Allen. If we're playing Diggs, we want Josh Allen. So if we're getting up to like Justin Jefferson on this roster plus a 7.5K running back, well, now all of a sudden, Paris Campbell is really what. Go ahead and throw in Josh Jacobs, and we can see what I'm talking about here. And then I'll talk about why Josh Jacobs. But if we have this right now, we've got 6K left at wide receiver. And that's with Paris Campbell, right? So we go up from Paris Campbell around 2 5K guys. We maybe go down from Paris Campbell to like Kendall Hinton or something like that. And then we have a little bit more flexibility, but we kind of see why Campbell is going to be popular this week. And we can take out some of these. We can take out Jefferson and Jacobs again, but I just wanted to illustrate like what this does to like what pricing really looks like this week.
Yeah, for sure. Talk to me a little bit about Josh Jacobs. I definitely don't know if he would have been one of the first guys I'd gravitate to, although I'm definitely down to pick on this Denver defense. Talk to me about the Josh Jacobs play.
Yeah, I was kind of disappointed when I looked at early ownership projections today and saw Jacobs over 20%. I thought that he would be like 8%, 10%, something like that. So Jacobs, so we take away the flu game, Jacobs and Devontae. We had the Jacobs plus Devontae pairing that we talked about a few weeks ago, how they'd scored 60 plus points in like 3 consecutive games. 5 straight games, if we take away the flu game, 5 straight games, one of Jacobs or Devontae has scored 30 plus points. That's crazy. Just an either or between those two. So just picking between them, you've had a 50-50 shot. In fact, better than 50-50 shot because one of those games, both of them scored 30 plus points. 3 of these 5 games, one of them has scored 37 plus points. This offense is so concentrated right now. Last week, I think it was 68% of all of the opportunities on this offense flowed through these 2 guys. And so we know that the matchup is better on the ground than through the air. If this game were not against this Denver defense at Denver, I would have a rule this week of one of Josh Jacobs or Devontae Adams on every single one of my 150 rosters because 30-point scores are going to be tough to come by this week. And if we can basically say, hey, one of these, I used to do this with the Vikings when they had like Diggs and Jefferson and Dalvin, and like that was the entire offense. And one of those guys is scoring 30 points every week. And it's like, if 30-point scores are going to be tough to come by, I can guarantee that half of my rosters are getting a 30-pointer. And the ones that miss, like these guys, are the guy who misses is still getting 20 points most weeks. So that's not killing you. With the tougher matchup, this will be more like 50, 60% of my rosters that I'll have one of Jacobs or Devontae on. But Jacobs is the guy I'm really gravitating toward this week. And hopefully that ownership trickles down a little bit. I think that the sentiment is a little bit different from what the projections are showing. So I think a lot of people will hesitate to push that Josh Jacobs button. He's priced right next to Joe Mixon, who obviously hit for a monster game the last time we saw him. So yeah, Josh Jacobs is just a guy I really like this week. I think a good shot at 30 points on a week where there might only be a few players who score 30 points.
Yeah, and if we did leave this, I mean, and I'm curious how you feel about him, but he would perfectly fit here if you did want to toss in Sutton at 6K in that same game.
Yeah. I actually really like that. And then we've got some ownership, right? Like Sutton's going to be owned. Paris Campbell's going to be owned. Justin Jefferson's going to be owned. Mariota's going to be owned. Montgomery's going to be owned. Pitts is really kind of our only super low owned guy. But what we have here are some intriguing pairings that other people won't have. A lot of people won't have Mariota plus Montgomery plus Pitts. A lot of people won't have Jacobs plus Sutton. A lot of people won't have Justin Jefferson plus Dalton Schultz. And so we kind of get like a nice mix of like correlated plays, good game environments, low ownership. And also when we talk about a pretty thin week, well, we have two of the top three game environments by Vegas implied totals covering 5 of our spots right here, which we really like, right? We've got the Bears and Falcons game covered. We have the Minnesota-Dallas game covered. We don't have any Bills pieces, but the Bills pieces we would want are Allen and Diggs, who are super expensive. That's not the direction we're going here. And then, we've got the one-offs on Paris Campbell, and then this kind of we love condensed offense. It's something that Squirrel and I talked about a couple weeks ago on the Roto Grinder show is like condensed offenses with lower implied team totals. A lot of times are even more powerful than spread out offenses with high implied team totals. Because in PPR scoring, when you know where the volume is going, there's just so much value in that. We know that Jacobs and Devontae are going to be absolutely central to the Raiders offense. If Jerry Jeudy's out, we know that Cortland Sutton's going to see a ton of targets. And so we just get like, instead of trying to get a thin bet right, we get a much fatter bet correct, right? It's like an easier target to hit on these guys where the volume is guaranteed.
Yeah, and I want to pull up this comment here too. So this lineup fades Buffalo completely. There's a few thoughts I have on this. One is a thing we talk about with JM a lot of like, when you build one lineup, there are going to be some pieces you like and some games you like that you don't get access to. And also part of the thing is when you build a lineup, you are playing for that game to fail. All those pieces that we're not using, we're playing for the scenarios. What if the Bills-Cleveland game fails? What are the other game environments, the other plays that could vault you to the top of the leaderboard? So again, I'm sure if JM and I built 100 rosters here, we did a 24-hour marathon stream, JM, you and me building rosters, I'm betting we would have a decent amount of Bills lineups, but also we would have lineups without the Bills. So again, as always, the usual caveats, we're building one lineup here as a thought exercise, and you can't play every good play.
Yeah, and I'll also throw out there, what are the chances of Devin Singletary burying you? What are the chances of Dawson Knox burying you? What are the chances of Isaiah McKenzie burying you? All really low, right? What are the chances of Gabe Davis? Gabe Davis is the one guy who can significantly exceed his salary, but we also know that he can crater a roster. So if we're not getting the Josh Allen, this specific Josh Allen, Stephon Diggs pairing, it's very easy for that game to hit and none of these other guys on the Bills to be players that would have helped you win a tournament. So all we're really saying is, hey, here's a roster where we're rostering a different quarterback. And as soon as we're rostering a different quarterback, we don't want Diggs because when Diggs hits, Josh Allen's hitting. So you might as well take that tandem pairing. You might as well take that free square. And so if we're not playing Allen, we're not playing Diggs. If we're not playing Diggs, we're not playing Allen. And so on this particular roster, we're just saying, okay, the Bills are going to put up points, but maybe it's not one of their just massive games. Maybe Diggs puts up 24, 25 DraftKings points. Maybe Josh Allen does roughly the same. And neither is a guy you had to have at their high salaries. The rest of the guys don't really scare us that much. I'll have plenty of Gabe Davis across my builds this week. I'll have some Dawson Knox. I'll have a little bit of Devin Singletary. But it's not like I'm afraid on one roster to not have those guys. Diggs and Allen are really the two guys we need to account for. And as soon as we start our roster with this building block or any other, as soon as we start a roster with Justin Fields, I'm not going to have Stephon Diggs on that roster because, again, if Diggs is hitting, Josh Allen's probably hitting too, so I might as well take advantage of that. And so, yeah, it's on this particular roster, it's not the way we end up going.
Yeah, and I pulled it up here, put it in my sheet. Just I always like to kind of benchmark it against that first optimal lineup I pulled out. You can see we're only 10 points off the ceiling. I think last week we were like 35 points off the ceiling with our Pickett build. And then on the flip side, we aren't getting as much of an ownership discount coming in 19. But you'll notice that last column is the product ownership, and that's going to be much lower than that chalky build. And I also think there's some fun pivots you could mess with here. Like if you did want to go to an Alec Pierce off of a Paris Campbell, that would open you up to maybe play Devonta Smith if you wanted to do instead of Sutton and do a mini there. Like, I think there's some fun stuff where you could tweak off of this lineup, but as like how you're thinking about construction, I feel like this lane that we took is a pretty good one.
Yeah. And it's a week where like this is 3-4 days for me of like getting a sense of this slate before I can even say like, oh, here's how to build on this slate, right? Like it's a hard slate to build on. So even just this thought exercise of us talking through and putting together a roster, I think is valuable for listeners, because if you're just diving into this week's slate, it does look really complicated to build on, but you can kind of break things down and start getting a sense of really where you can go this week and how you can put together a sharp roster.
I was clearly joking about this 24-hour stream, and then you give these guys an inch and now they want a 24-hour stream. Maybe when my baby comes and I'm just up 24 hours around the clock anyways, yeah, we could just do it.
Yeah, and my daughter's waking up at 5:30 every morning right now, so I'm getting 4.5 to 5.5 hours of sleep. So yeah, we got a good 20 hours that we could put in together where we will not be sleeping and just run a live stream, have the kids running around on my end, and you can hold your baby the whole time.
Man, it's a bummer I'm turning into such an old man, because that does seem like it'd be a fun content play. You could bring a lot of people on. You build everyone around the industry, and you build.
Well, I like this. I like it. I like you doing the 24-hour stream, and then I come on for like 2 hours, and then
2 hours.
And then that's it. Yeah, I'll watch the rest of it.
I might need to talk to SBF about some, amphetamines and some Adderall to help you get through that live stream. Thank you, GA, for becoming a YouTube member. That'll get you access to the Sunday morning crams. I do those every Sunday at 10:30 a.m. We go over updated news from overnight reports, updated ownership, looking at the ceiling optimals, best GPP plays, all that good stuff for YouTube members. And also you will get access to the Hand Builders and OptoBro DFS channel in the Discord. Been sharing showdown plays. Had a nice showdown night last night, JM. Unfortunately, I had the winning lineup in the dollar contest and not the big one. So just a little 69K swing there, having the lineup in the wrong contest. But it is what it is.
Who needs that kind of money?
No, you're right. It would just go to my head and I would be insufferable. So you gotta stay humble here. So yeah, that's all the stuff on my end. Obviously, got to check out 1 week season. Take advantage of the 60% off. Pete 60 will get you the run of the land there for the rest of the season. Jam, anything else on your radar? Anything I'm forgetting here?
No, nothing else. I'm thankful for doing this show with you. How's that? You're excellent at what you do. Love doing this every week.
I appreciate it. And yeah, and just we just talked here too. Obviously, we have Thanksgiving next Thursday, but JM and I fully plan to be back at our normal time Friday at 2 p.m. Although, as I told JM before the show, all bets starting to be off. My the baby's due date's December 1st, so we could be getting in dicey territory. But provided no baby, there will be a JM and Pete block party show. Appreciate all of you guys. Excited to see all of you at the top of the leaderboards in week 11. Have a great weekend. We'll talk to you guys next time.